there were two general threads that came out of the comments on our last episode, other than how much people liked it. And the first is that for whatever reason, even though you just mentioned to me you might clean up your language, everyone loved when you swore. And the other was the request that we get deeper into Marx and perhaps some criticism of his theories and your views. But just to start off, since the man himself has become more of a legend than a real person, and his views, I think, have been really twisted as well. Just who was Karl Marx, and what sort of world did he live in to motivate his writings?
Okay. Well, let's start with the basics. He was born in 1818 and he died in 1883. So he was literally and quintessentially a man of the 19th century. When he's born, Europe is in the early throes of a transition out of feudalism. I mean, that was well along into capitalism, but he grew up at a time when the implications of the American and French revolutions were really beginning to wash over Europe. And being born at the juncture between France and Germany, they were coming from the West, moving east across Europe. And he was caught up as a young man in the excitement of a new world that he was already part of and growing into and born into. Feudalism was more and more a memory. Deeply impressed, 1,000 years of feudalism left its traces and still does, but for Marx, it was a new world. And to understand his mentality, he was he was a middle-class kid, we would nowadays say. He was born to people who were literate. He was born to people who not only expected but supported that he would go to a university, which a very small part of the population at that point even imagined, let alone did. So he was he wasn't super rich or anything like that, but he was a comfortable middle class, we might say, kind of family. Went to the school, took it all very seriously. His father was what was called in the French-German area where he comes from, a free thinker. That was very, very, very important in Europe at that time. It meant that you had broken from religion, both from Catholicism and from Protestantism, the Lutheran explosion of the church, or if you came out of the Jewish tradition, that the orthodoxy and the taking religion seriously was something people were proud no longer to do. And there was a community, a sizable one, growing quickly, of what were called Freidenker in German, free thinker, literally free thinkers. And the father was part of that, and the son grew up into that. So he was not part of a religious background. To give you an idea of what shaped the young man, it was, the music of Beethoven. Try to imagine these triumphant symphonies in which people are breaking into a great new world. If you're familiar, for example, with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, a choral symphony that includes a whole huge chorus that ends that symphony with an ode to joy, in which, a new world is being born, in which human beings will treat each other with respect, with equality. Marx took dreadfully seriously as a young man, as many in his generation did, the slogans of the French Revolution, which he deeply admired. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. In fact, that last part of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony is all about brotherhood and what all that will mean. So he enters the world of intellect. He becomes a teenager and a young man, caught up in the notion that capitalism, the successor system after feudalism, was ushering in as it had promised to do. And by that, I mean everybody from, Thomas Jefferson on over to Danton and Robespierre and all of the great ideologues, you might call them, of the end of feudalism. When the United States breaks away from Britain, governed by a feudal leftover, King George III, they talk about it, but they do not have a kingdom here. As an independent breakaway, they were breaking away not only from the British Empire, but from feudalism, from monarchy, the institutions of feudalism, in order to have a new, free, different society. And Marx took all of that very seriously and felt himself and wanted to be part of that. The problem was, for him, that as he went through the university, and for those of you who don't know, he studied philosophy. He went all the way up to the writing of a doctoral dissertation on Greek philosophy. Epictetus was his subject and so forth. And his first job was as a young, what we would here call an assistant professor in a German university, teaching philosophy. Okay? And he was headed on to be that. His greatest influence, besides the French Revolution, the American experiment, as he could judge it from afar, was the German philosopher who was the dominant influence in the universities of Germany at that time, a man named Hegel, who had developed a kind of peak of German philosophy, building on the great tradition that goes from Immanuel Kant through Schelling to Fichte to Hegel as a kind of dominant influence, as it has been both in those who follow it and in those who react against it, really ever since. There are very powerful Hegelian influences in postmodernism, in existentialism, in literally every movement of philosophy since that time. And Marx was one of the students, and his closest friends intellectually and his colleagues were likewise students of Hegel. Okay, so that's where he is. The problem arises as he begins to be an adult thinking philosophy professor. He begins to look around. He's interested in the world around him. He's not the ivory tower kind of professor, if I can make that distinction. His interests go beyond his specialty. They go beyond the universe of the university to a larger society. And there he discovers, and again, long story short, because we don't have all the time we could take for this, he discovers that what capitalism promised in slogans like liberty, equality, fraternity, and let's add from the American Revolution, democracy, you put all those together, that capitalism promised that with the end of feudalism and the arrival of this new capitalist system, they would deliver to the human race what it had for so long wanted: liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy, a better world. And he looked around and he drew a conclusion, tentative at first, But then across his life, it became deeper and richer, but it was the same conclusion. And that was that capitalism had failed to deliver the promises made on its behalf by those revolutionaries who finished feudalism and ushered in capitalism. That the system had betrayed its own founders. Not that unusual in human history, but Marx was the great thinker who made that determination, if you like, in a very profound way, both early in his life and then across the fullness of it, as I'll show you in the next few minutes, if there's time for me to do that. And so you might say he began to shift his interest from philosophy to what we would nowadays call political economy. Why? Because in his thinking, he wasn't interested, once he had determined that capitalism had betrayed its origins, had failed to deliver on its grand social progress promises, his next logical question, he's a philosopher, is why did this happen? Why did he didn't toy with superficial noise. He didn't look for the bad people who did the terrible thing of undoing the promise. That's a kind of cheap politics. He never did that. He wanted, as a philosopher, to ask the question, what happened? He didn't question that Jefferson was sincere or that the philosophers of the French Revolution, both before the Revolution, during the Revolution, and after, they were genuinely committed to liberty, equality, fraternity. They were moved by those objectives. They thought they were doing that. So what went wrong, he said? And to answer that question, he began to read and think beyond the confines of the Greek philosophy he had mastered as a PhD student. And he found himself drawn into the literatures of history, sociology, we would call it that now, it didn't have those names. That history did, but sociology comes later. But we would nowadays, that's what he was reading. And he encountered two things that particularly struck him. The revolutionary literature of the French. You know, for all of the Europeans, to this day, there's a revolutionary impulse in France that is an absolute draw for the European, and for beyond Europe, those who are familiar with it. That's, you know, the French to this day have the yellow vests. The French to this day have an enormously powerful socialist and communist population. They're on the street at the drop of a hat. They care about their political life in a way that other European countries look to as a model, although rarely achieve. And Marx, early on, noticed this too. You know, if you read Rousseau or Voltaire or Diderot, and remember, Marx is an intellectual, he reads a great deal, he's caught up in French revolutionary literature. The other literature he discovers is germane to his quest, again, to understand why the transition from feudalism to capitalism could not or would not deliver on its promises of liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. He discovers British political economy. So those become his three great influences: German philosophy from Hegel, French revolutionary politics, and British economics or British political economy, and above all, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, because those are the great thinkers of economics just before him. Literally, a few years. I don't remember exactly when David Ricardo died, but my guess is he died. Marx was born before Ricardo died. Okay, so there's a continuity there. And so that was Marx's quest. And what he began to do was to try to understand how to get an answer. And in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is to tell you what he found. His answer was developed across the fullness of his works, which I'll summarize in a moment. His answer was capitalism betrayed its promise, not because of an external phenomena that held capitalism back or that constricted its functioning. No, capitalism betrayed its promises because internal to capitalism are the mechanisms that block liberty, fraternity, and equality from happening. Capitalism is the problem. It's not the liberation, it's the problem. And that problem is buried right in the core of what's unique about it as a system. And in Marx's mature work, culminating in the great work of his life, which is called Das Kapital, or Capital. And again, that's a 3-volume work. Marx himself only wrote the first volume. The second and third volumes were notebooks that he kept that were assembled and edited by others later, even though they still appear under his name. His partner, his intellectual partner, Friedrich Engels, basically put together the second, and one of their great students, a German Marxist named Karl Kautsky, put together the third volume. But in that work and other works of his mature years, he explained what it was about capitalism that frustrated the achievement of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I don't mind telling you very simply that because you can simplify it since he's done all the hard work of figuring it out, the answer was that even though capitalism broke from slavery because it doesn't allow people to own each other or anything like that, and capitalism broke away from feudalism because it blew up the lord-serf relationship that had governed Europe for 1,000 years. It broke from them, wanted to break from them, achieved a break from them. But what it didn't understand was that by erecting in their place a relationship in the workplace, in the enterprise, in the factory or the office or the store, an employer-employee dichotomy, you were replicating the lord and the serf, the master and the slave, but with a new name, employer-employee. And in that relationship was the blockage that precluded liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's a very sophisticated argument, very carefully worked out, enormously filled with evidence, examples, logical connections. This is the finest kind of intellectual, analytical work. If you've never read through it, if you've never had anyone take you through it, you can't possibly understand it. And to substitute a dismissive notion only shows you're childish. It would be a little bit like having a quick dismissal of other great works like Hegel's philosophy or St. Augustine's Confessions or Einstein's discoveries or anything else. The quick, easy dismissal tells us only about you, not about the work you're purporting to dismiss. A serious education in the world today without Marx is an admission that what you're studying and how you study is governed more by your fear than by your brain or your intellectual curiosity. It's pathetic in the literal meaning of the term that for the last 70 years here in the United States, and let me remind you, I was born in Ohio. I've lived all my life in the United States. I've worked all my life in the United States. I'm talking to you right now from New York City. It's only been fear, otherwise known as the Cold War and its legacy, that have led the intellectual community and the universities to be as hostile and dismissive and fundamentally ignorant about what Marx achieved. It's childish. We live in a capitalist world, and those of us of my age have done so all our lives. Marx was and remains the most profound critic of that system that we have. To live in a system and refuse to engage in the work of the most important, serious critic reflects on you, not on the Marxism. And when I say to you, as I will now, that those works of Marx have spread to every country on this planet. He died in 1883. That means roughly 150 years less since his death. His work, his ideas have spread on a scale few intellectual movements have in the history of the human race. You'd have to go back to Muhammad or others to talk about a body of work that spreads that fast over the whole globe. Every country on earth has Marxist journals, Marxist organizations, Marxist theoretical political movements, and on and on and on. And I'm not even going to talk, because of our limited time, about the governments like, for example, the People's Republic of China, which make Marx their intellectual or theoretical founder in some sense. Mm-hmm. So it's really kind of remarkable that one has to, and I mean, in no way criticizing you're posing me that questions. You absolutely should, but there's also a sadness that you should, because it should be, the common awareness, not that you agree with him, of course not. You don't read Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or Albert Einstein or Sigmund Freud in order to become a student who repeats it. You want to think about it. You want to interrogate it. You want to integrate it with the rest of your formation as a thinking person, because you don't want to be denied that. You don't want to have that absent from the resources you bring to the contributions you make. To do that with Marx is childish, self-indulgently, self-destructive. It weakens the quality of American intellectual life, and it always has. And if you're wondering, since I'm a product of the United States, why I have the interest and have done the reading and can talk to you about any of the work Marx and Marxists have done, it's because I figured that out kind of early in my life. I was lucky. I had some adults when I was young who gave me some reason to be interested in this. But I have to tell you, in all honesty, as a person who went through the elite education of the United States, I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. I went to Stanford in between, and I finished at Yale. It's like a joke. And I had 10 years, 2 semesters a year, 20 semesters. In one of them, a teacher gave me some Marxism to read. In the other 19, my teachers at those 3 institutions behaved as if Marx wasn't there. Extraordinary. And what the historians will look back on this bizarre behavior with the kind of critical opprobrium that it deserves. All right, is that a reasonable overview, or would you want me to talk about something else having to do with Karl?